Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and we're on the final part 4 of our story tonight. It's only 4 parts, and so it's very, very exciting, and let's continue with part 4 of our story. 2 weeks later, I carefully parked my white Hyundai at the edge of the woods. I wasn't sure exactly what I was doing, but I was doing it anyway, almost as if I'd been propelled to come here. If I was persuading myself that I was a sleuth, well, that was rather far-fetched. If Mrs. Thornton had deliberately run over her daughter in the early 70s, when Jackie was 7 years old, I needed to find out about it. But spying on her was unlikely to give me the answers I was looking for. But for some reason I felt propelled to do this. I guess I wanted a bird's-eye view of what she was like as a person, get a sense of who she was before I made my next strategic move, whatever that was supposed to be. I didn't even have the answer to that question. If my husband Donnie could see me now, he'd have been appalled that his wife was almost playing peekaboo in the woods. But approaching Mrs. Thornton's house through the woods, going the back way, I felt would give me the perfect view onto her backyard. I was envisaging Mrs. Thornton to be a monster. I mean, anyone who runs over their child on purpose is not fit to be called human, right? I knew I needed to confront her in some way about what she'd done to her daughter all those years ago. I think the little girl Jackie wanted her mother to admit what she had done. That was why I assumed she was seeking help from me from beyond the grave. As to why Jackie Thornton had singled me out to help her, I could not be sure. The road I found myself on was one of those dead-beat narrow dirt roads, even more sequestered than the back road to our property, and there were tall, lanky trees clustered together in tight congregations of quaking aspens, with white tree trunks and rounded yellow or greenish leaves, intermingled with hawthorn bushes, honeysuckle, and a plethora of hazelnut trees, growing wildly in this eclectic mix. I parked my car and cautiously made my intrepid journey into the woods. The paths were wildly overgrown, with a tangle of thorny briars brazenly crossing my path, too many times to count, and very often I stumbled across fallen tree trunks covered with both moss and lichen, but I didn't allow that to put me off. As I had expected, there wasn't a solitary soul in sight in this woodgrove, but with unfriendly overgrown trails like this, that was not exactly a surprise to me. Yet despite my sashaying through the woods like this, for some incongruous reason, I felt as if I was not alone, as if eyes were burning into the back of my skull, like an itch I wanted to scratch. But when I turned around to look behind me and over my shoulders, no one was there. The feeling of being watched sent inauspicious prickles descending down my spine. But I told myself it was the quaking aspen trees. These trees move on their own, hence the name. Several of them before me were literally quaking, bending their boughs in sweeping motions, like leggy ballerinas nimbly bending down to the ground to touch their toes, wearing outfits that swished as they moved. There was a still breeze blowing, making the trees even more ebullient than usual. They swung their branches noisily, their leaves rustled in the wind, as if hundreds of feisty cheerleaders with their pom-poms were encouraging me to move ahead with my mission at hand, whatever that was supposed to be. It was almost as if they were whispering to me, "This way, this way, this way." My lightweight walking boots grazed the uneven ground that was liberally bespeckled with grassy patches and low-lying shrubs. The woodgrove was immense. I felt as if I was caught up in some kind of tangled obstacle course. My binoculars began to swing around my neck as I moved stealthily forwards through the trees, hoping that sooner or later I'd spot the Thornton property through the branches, as I clandestinely made my approach. It looked like no one had been in these woods for years. I was cursing under my breath as the paths were so awkwardly narrow. All of a sudden something pelted me on the back. It was a light stone. What the hell, I thought, almost jumping out of my skin, my belly doing flip-flops. Who had done that? Was someone in the woods with me, playing games on me? Children, perhaps, I thought, waiting to hear a giggle, but I heard nothing. I looked up, but nothing was there. I tried to scan the trees, but still I saw nothing. But I knew someone had thrown a stone at me. Stones don't magically become airborne on their own accord, do they? That was when I noticed a patch of black in my peripheral vision. My eyes quickly moved towards the shadowy obscurity that was dense, broad, and very still. And it was so black against the white trunks of the trees that I knew at once that something was there. In a trice, I observed a huge bullet-shaped head with ponderous shoulders, peering at me very shyly from behind a white withered tree trunk that was bent over at odd angles, its monumental branches hunched to one side, like a very old man who couldn't stand up straight. I closed my eyes, squeezing them as tightly as I possibly could, as this thing I was seeing, it couldn't be real. No, it couldn't be. My heart began urgently flapping. It thundered in my chest so that its pounding beats boomed in my ears. I was afraid to open my eyes, terrified of what I would see, but I opened them very cautiously, very, very slowly. And once again, this absurd, idiosyncratic creature was still there behind the tree. It gingerly moved away from the tree and stood before me, larger than life, only 5 feet from where I was standing. It was so close to me I could hear its shallow breathing and see its nostrils tweaking as it breathed, and the jaws of the creature seemed to relax, its lips almost turned upwards into what I might describe as a smile, but I couldn't be too sure about that. This was too much for my brain to assimilate, far too much to digest. I wanted to regurgitate what I was seeing, like purging the excesses of a rather unsavoury meal. I wanted to pretend that this thing was not there, to will the image away. So I hurriedly closed my eyes again, begging for the image to leave me. But I heard a voice in my head saying, "Get over it. I'm real. We have work we need to do. I'll show you the way through the woods. The little girl has waited long enough for you to help her, so don't procrastinate now." I opened my eyes wide, and I looked at the creature standing before me. I realized it was a Bigfoot. I should have been terrified because it was breathtakingly huge, so powerful, robust, strong. And in its presence I felt as tiny and as inconspicuous as a mouse. This Bigfoot could have flung a fist at me, and I would almost certainly be dead. But I knew that as intimidating as he appeared, he meant me no harm, and that as bashful and evasive as he was the one that had approached me. I had a profound sense that he'd been waiting for me to arrive in the grove, almost as if he'd been expecting me to come. Is that why I had been drawn to come here today? Being pulled into these woods like a magnet to iron filings? It would seem so. I had seen big images of Bigfoot outside occasional diners in parts of North America before, like in California, near the Redwood State Park. But this creature was nothing like the images I'd seen portrayed, that I believe rather resembled a mountain gorilla than what I was observing right now. The Bigfoot resembled a hairy man, only his proportions were Herculean in size. He had overlong arms, a bullet-shaped head, ponderous shoulders. He was covered in long flowing hair, the colour of midnight. His face was very expressive and wizened, as if he was a creature of remarkable intelligence that was far superior to my own. Furthermore, he definitely did not stink, which surprised me, based on what I had heard about Bigfoot smelling really bad. This was certainly not the case. The Bigfoot had a bountiful abundance of long dark hair. You'd have almost certainly thought that in the circumstances he would get sweaty and smelly, but his body odour was benign, as if his body temperature was perfectly regulated. He smelt exactly like the grove, which meant his ambiguous presence behind the trees would not have been discernible if he had not made himself known to me, which made perfect sense. I believe nasty odours give you away, and Bigfoot by nature is clearly evasive, so smelling nasty odours would easily get your attention. My heart began pounding in my chest, only because the Bigfoot was so large, so intimidating, but he was benevolent, and seemed so bashful, so I knew he had no intention of harming me. His dark treacle-coloured eyes were both soulful and kind. "You know about the little girl. How could you know about her? She comes to me in my dreams. She's the reason I'm here today." The Bigfoot seemed almost to laugh. "You don't know very much, do you? She comes to me too. She's insistent and tenacious. I'll give her that. You think you came to the woods today just by chance? Not so. She led you here. I was the one that called you as well. She's standing behind you, eager for you to get moving. She's appeared to you because you can see her. My kind can see into the realms of spirit. Your kind are not quite so good at that. I don't normally approach your kind, but this girl is not giving up, so I can't exactly ignore her. She needs you to speak on her behalf to her mother. She wants her mother to confess to what she did all those years ago, so that peace will finally be restored to her family, who have suffered enough from their grief. Once she's satisfied that this is done, she will happily go back to the light. Come this way," said the Bigfoot. "I'll show you where the house is." He beckoned for me to follow him. I was completely confounded that this Bigfoot had the ability to communicate with me so articulately in a telepathic exchange, which was non-verbal, but the words were perfectly downloaded into my head, so I understood everything he was saying. Furthermore, the Bigfoot obviously had psychic abilities, for he was interacting with a dead girl that had approached me in my dreams, wanting help. This Jackie Thornton was quite the character, and if she really was with me now, I couldn't see her, and I was thankful for that. I followed the Bigfoot through the tall, lofty trees, until I saw the shadowy shape of a house staring back at me through the leafy branches. It appeared cold, austere, unwelcoming, grey and rather dreary, against a perfectly beautiful cobalt blue sky, as if it reflected the melancholy of its residents. The Bigfoot pointed at the bland-looking ranch-style property that was as average and standard as they come, but probably cost a pretty penny. But it was certainly nothing on the house that they had once owned, where I was living now, which was so warm and inviting, the perfect embodiment of a true family home. "The girl's mother is in there," he told me in my head. "You go and sort this out." I was amazed that he continued to speak to me telepathically, but when he did so, he appeared to be mumbling, and I was certain I picked up some strange language he was speaking. "But I can't go in there," I told him. "You can," said the Bigfoot, "and you must. I will be here waiting for you in the grove. You need to do this for the girl's sake, or she won't leave me alone, nor will she leave you. You have to do this." So there I was, walking through the trees towards the back of the property, where a woman in her 50s was wearing a pair of yoga pants and a grey sweater with the logo on it which read, "It's a dog's life, but someone's got to do it." She appeared to be feeding some hungry chickens outside the back door of the family kitchen. She looked up at me from her bowl of chicken feed, with an expression of surprise on her face. I noticed her dark brown eyes were drawn questioningly to the binoculars hanging around my neck. I observed a scowl developing on her face. Should I pretend to have been bird-watching? But that would not excuse my trespassing on her property, even if I had run into America's rarest bird, the California condor, or the ivy-hooded woodpecker. Did I actually have an excuse to explain my unfathomable presence on her property, as most people would visit a house by the front entrance, but not me, it would seem. "And who might you be?" she asked, her eyes narrowing suspiciously as they swept from my boots up to my eyes. Her neck stiffened, and her slouched body straightened up, as if to make herself appear bigger and more intimidating. "You came through the woods, not the front way. What on earth are you doing on our property? Are you spying on us by any chance?" she asked, her eyes pointingly resting on my binoculars. "No, nothing of the kind," I said apologetically, suddenly feeling the blood rushing from my chest up to my neck and all over my face. As the truth was, I had intended to spy on this woman and her mother, until the Bigfoot had persuaded me to go straight up to the property. But no one expected you to enter their house via the back way, like I had done. Actually, I'm here to have words with your mother, Mrs. Thornton. She does live here, does she not? I got your new address from Paula Erickson. The woman's face suddenly softened. Paula Erickson? Oh, my word! Now that is a blast from the past. She used to babysit for me when I was a little girl. My family lived next door to her. Lovely lady she was, lived with her parents in the house. I remember her mother spoiling us rotten when we lived back there in the good old days. I was a little girl back then, but I vividly recall the house where we lived. It was a special place. Spectacular views over the lake. Mrs. Erickson's mother would always make us homemade lemonade and cookies. Paula used to babysit for us when we were little, so a friend of hers is a friend of ours. We have seen her in town from time to time, but I think I last saw her about a year ago. How is she doing? I hope she's doing well. You'll be glad to know she's absolutely fine, doing very well. You must be Sylvia Thornton. Mrs. Erickson told me about you and that you live with your mother here. That's right. Mrs. Erickson appears to have told you quite a lot. Who might you be? Well, I'm the new owner of the original Thornton property that you lived in when you were a little girl. The name's Molly Potoma. What do you want to see my mother about, Molly? Asked the woman protectively. My mother is not so young these days. She recently had a hip replacement. She's tired, worn out and exhausted, and I certainly don't want her getting upset about anything. I do need to speak to her. It is very important. Very well. If that's the case, you better come through, hadn't you? Follow me through the kitchen door, will you? But word of advice, next time it would be a whole lot easier for you if you came the front way. It's very tricky navigating your way through those woods to get to this house, and frankly, I honestly don't know how you did it. I'm surprised you found your way. I got lost in those woods once, and believe me, it wasn't pretty. Mum, she called out as she opened the kitchen door and led Molly into the interior of their family home. Two of the hens she'd been feeding seemed eager to come inside, but she shooed them away. No, Rooster, get out, will you? Get out! And as for you, Bailey, stop it, will you stop it? Get out, girl! It was rather funny that she called two hens, that were actually chickens and not males, boys' names, but I said nothing. The hens seemed rather disappointed not to manipulate their way into the kitchen, as Sylvia Thornton closed the door behind them. Mum, she called out, we have a guest here who'd like to see you in person. She moved into our old house that overlooked the lake, remember the one? She lives next door to Paula Erickson. Coming, dear, came a voice, and then an old lady came bustling into the kitchen, hobbling a little as she moved. I suspected she was struggling to adjust from her hip replacement surgery. It certainly seemed as if she was in pain, because I saw her wincing a couple of times. Maybe coming now was not a good idea after all. I certainly didn't want to upset this woman, but I knew the ghost child would not leave me alone if I did not, and I couldn't stomach any more of those dreadful nightmares that I had been experiencing. The old woman was not the monster that I was expecting her to be. She didn't have the cold, heartless eyes and insouciant disposition that I thought she would have had. On the contrary, she looked like a genuinely nice old lady that most would like at once, and I certainly did, but I wished I did not. She was withered from a combination of age and grief. Her crepey skin clung tightly to her face, almost looking translucent. The fragile, delicate skin around her eyes was covered in a clustered feathering of fine lines, and her bright cornflower blue eyes, although dappled with sadness, appeared friendly towards me. She was certainly a lot more amenable and approachable than her guarded, circumspect daughter Sylvia, who'd been suspicious of me from the get-go, and was watching me warily like a bull terrier, or some kind of custodian, that might just strike if you imposed any kind of threat. She stood resolutely in the doorway, watching me with her mother, her ferret-like eyes burrowing into me. She wanted to find out why I was there. I wish with all my heart she would go away, but she stood there in the doorway, beadily watching us with a jaundiced, sceptical gaze. The old woman was wearing a long, flowery Laura Ashley-style skirt that skimmed her slender ankles, a white blouse with a cameo brooch. She was well presented, and beckoned for me to take a seat on a comfortable sofa chair in her sumptuously cosy living room that was very elegant. I noticed on the mantel over the fireplace, in pride of place, was a picture of a blonde girl, smiling widely into the camera. I drew in a sharp breath, and my heart began to flounce in my chest with apprehension. It was Jackie Thornton, the little girl that had been visiting me in my dreams. In the photograph she was holding her mother's hand, and a blue teddy bear in the other hand. She looked into the photograph with a wide, toothy grin. Seeing the picture turned my blood so cold, gave me chills. It was like my nightmare had been thrust rudely into my face. The woman followed my gaze. She looked sad. "That was my daughter, Jackie," she said sorrowfully. "She died an awfully long time ago, I'm afraid, but she'll never, ever be forgotten. I leave her photograph on the mantel, so she's still part of our lives. I miss her so dreadfully. You never get over losing a child, do you? After her death, our family was never ever the same. There was a huge gulf in our lives. But as strange as it may sound, I often feel her presence around. Maybe it's just my wishful thinking." "She looks like a lovely girl," I said. "I'm very sorry for your loss."
"Thank you, my dear. Very nice of you to say. Anyway, more to the point, it's so kind of you to visit me. Have we ever met before? If you will forgive me, your face does not seem familiar. Should I know you? Did I meet you at church, perhaps? If Denise Featherling sent you here because she wants me to clean the silver candlesticks in the church, please tell her it'll be a while until I get my strength back. I'm still recovering from my hip operation, but next month I'm sure I'll be fighting fit and be able to return to the old schedule. I might even lend a hand with the flower arranging, but I'm not up to any of that right now. I don't mean to be unkind, but Denise can be a little pushy at times. The woman's in her 30s, you know. She doesn't understand that an old body like mine doesn't repair as quickly as a young one does. She seems to be quick to forget that I'm no spring chicken."
"No, you'll be glad to know I'm not from the church. I'm Paula Erickson's new neighbour. The name's Molly. I moved into the Thornton property, the original one, very recently. The house you lived before your family moved here, I believe it was."
"That's right. Sylvia said, didn't she? Oh, that was such a beautiful house it was. The best our family ever owned, you know. How are you enjoying your new home? I moved into that house when I was very young. The views were spectacular over the lake. Sylvia, dear, will you bring us some refreshments? So what brings you here, my dear? I can sense that this is not a social visit. As why would a young lady like yourself be wanting to spend her time with an old biddy like me?"
"Don't sell yourself short," I said. "I have many old friends who are your age, and they're interesting people, much more interesting than some of the girls my own age. You learn a lot of invaluable stuff from older people, you know, and my grandparents are the most interesting people I know. I'm particularly close to my grandmother."
"Well, you make a good point, dear. So why are you here, then?"
"This is a little awkward. I don't know how to put it because it's going to sound strange, but it all began when I was about 16 years old. I'd have these terrible nightmares, you see, long before I moved into your old house. A young girl would stand at the end of my bed. Her nightdress was covered in blood. She asked me to help her. The young girl's name was Jackie Thornton, the girl that visited me in my nightmares. It's the same girl in the photograph on your mantel, your little girl that tragically died." The old woman let out an astonished gasp. She covered her mouth protectively. Sylvia, who was still standing in the doorway, marched over to me, her face stern, her jowls jiggling in indignation. She pointed an accusatory finger at me.
"How dare you come here like this? My mother has only recently recovered from a hip operation, and you come here to talk about Jackie, her little girl who died tragically when she was 7 years old. She was my mother's youngest daughter. You want to open up all these old wounds? Are you sick in the head or something? Hasn't my mother been through enough? I'm sure you realize that talking about the little girl she lost is very upsetting for her. How dare you?"
The old woman waved her daughter away.
"Sylvia, you're being dreadfully rude to our guest. I thought you were going to get refreshments for us, but you just continually stand in the doorway. You're not being hospitable nor kind to our guest. Now off with you now. I think some homemade ginger beer and some of those delicious brownies you baked would go down a treat. I'd appreciate it if you go and get them, will you?"
Sylvia growled at me.
"I'm warning you, lady. If you dare upset my mother, you'll have me to deal with. Believe you me, I'm not nice when I'm angry, and I won't hesitate to kick you out of this house. Do you understand?" "I'm so sorry about that," said the old lady. "Sylvia gets very dramatic about things." Her daughter had thundered off into the kitchen and was clanking away loudly with the cutlery, so that her frustration could be heard from the living room. I was in no doubt Sylvia regretted inviting me into her house to see her mother, and was obviously expressing her indignation in the kitchen by smashing everything in sight. She was very protective over her mother. That could not be doubted. "Let me get this right," said Mrs. Thornton, looking nonplussed. "Are you saying that you've been visited by the ghost of my little girl? I've heard of such things before. But why would she visit you?"
"I believe she has, Mrs. Thornton. The visitation stopped after I told her to go to the light. That was when I was 16 years old. She did tell me she'd be back again when the time was right. I think she felt she had some unfinished business to attend to. And she's back again. Well, after I moved into your house, that is. Me and my husband recently bought your old property, which I'm now convinced was orchestrated by your late daughter, because it was the house that your daughter visited me in my dreams. The moment I laid eyes on the property, I knew it was the one for me, as if something was drawing me to the place. I suspect the drawer was actually your daughter. I put an offer on the house before the estate agent finished showing us around the place. It was a déjà vu-like experience, as if I was coming home in a manner of speaking."
"How extraordinary! Do please go on."
"Well, your little girl, Jackie, has been appearing to me in my dreams again, shortly after we moved into your old house. She's been asking me for help. I wasn't sure how I could give her any help, as she's dead. But when I removed wallpaper in the closet of our bedroom, I observed a child's handwriting done in crayon. The words written were, 'It was not an accident.' I put 2 and 2 together, and I sincerely hope I didn't make 6 with that. But it's why I'm here. I'm not saying what occurred when you ran over your daughter in the driveway wasn't an accident. I don't know the answer to that question. Only you know that. But your little girl is looking for closure in some way, and that's why I came here, if that makes any sense to you. On her behalf, that is."
"How dare you come to my mother's house like this, and unearth all this dreadful stuff that happened a long time ago? Can't you see? My mother has had a hip replacement operation. And you have the audacity to come here and upset her like this, came Sylvia's indignant voice. She stood in the doorway rattling a tray of refreshments in her hands. She appeared to be trembling. Who do you think you are anyway? Some kind of smug little Hercule Poirot? Is that it? Or are you an undercover reporter, grasping at straws, to spin out an incredulous story to feed your frenzied shark-like readers, hungry for blood, an entire bunch of baloney? Is that it? Of course my little sister's death was traumatic, but it was an accident. What the hell are you implying? That my mother here is some kind of cold-blooded, callous murderer? I think you better go. You have no right to be here. You disgust me. Get out! Sylvia was so mad, her whole body was shaking like a leaf, and the ice-cold glasses of ginger beer tinkled and slid precariously on the tray. They began to rattle, and for a moment I did wonder if she'd dropped the entire tray, but she managed to regain her balance as she straightened herself up. If you must know, I was the one that wrote the message in the closet, she said, her eyes brimming with tears. But it doesn't mean it was true. I made it all up. As I told you, you're barking up the wrong tree. You better leave. Sylvia, look at you. You're in such a state, my love. Calm down, dear, said her mother. And for goodness sake, put down the tray before all those glasses break. If you wrote on the wall it wasn't an accident, you were right. It wasn't. You knew the truth, as I did too, Sylvia. It's about time the truth came out. The guilt has been festering inside me for years and years, eating me alive. Mum, for goodness sake, don't talk like this, said Sylvia. You're implicating yourself in a crime. This woman might go to the authorities, blab on you. Do you want to go to prison for the remainder of your life? I know how much you love Jackie, Mother. It was one of those things that got out of control, that's all. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. They rolled down her cheeks. I don't care about all that, sweetheart. If I go to prison, it's what I deserve for what I did back then. That's not why I'm here, I insisted. I'm here for your daughter, Jackie Thornton. Your little girl, Mrs. Thornton, wanted to feel some closure, that's all. Maybe speaking about this event is what she needs from you. I can see you're very distressed about what happened. So I think you've been punished enough. I won't be going to the authorities. Anyway, it's a bit late in the day for that. I think what your little girl wants, Mrs. Thornton, is the truth. Perhaps she wants you to release your own pain, because you've been swallowed alive by your guilt, I can see. It wasn't an accident, said Mrs. Thornton, but it was not premeditated. It was a moment of complete unbridled madness, when I lost my mind and did something so impulsively, like when you're angry with someone and you throw something at them, and afterwards you regret what you've done, or when a wild horse just beats about frantically and then harms, the groom or something. It was like that. Tell me about it, I coaxed gently. I was very young when I first had children. When Larry was born, I was 15 years old. Can you imagine that, my dear? I got married to my husband at a very young age. But we were madly in love, we were, pleased to be together, although my parents and his parents weren't remotely amused that we got together so young. In those days, getting pregnant before you were married brought great shame on your family and disgrace, and my parents cared very passionately about the opinions of others. So we were persuaded to get married very young. We were to run off, get married behind our parents' back, so that was the story that they would feed everybody. Being a mother when I was a child myself was never easy. I felt as if I had thrown my childhood away to become a full-time mother, so to speak. It was hard work dealing with screaming children, especially when I was one myself. I wanted to be out there having fun with my friends, but instead I was saddled with a full-time responsibility. And my poor husband, bless his socks, he couldn't go to college like anybody else, but started working at a bank to provide for us all, from the bottom up. He became very successful, I might add. When Jackie came along, it was an absolute nightmare. There is no other word to describe it. When she was born, she had colic. She would scream tirelessly all night long. And when she got a wee bit older, and she was a child, she was so hyperactive. Even when we went to sleep at night, she would come into our bedroom and bounce on our bed as if it was a trampoline. She always wanted to play. She was very attached to her blue teddy bear. Wherever she went, the teddy bear followed her. She called her teddy bear Mr. Blue. I felt as if I was barely functioning. My husband was thinking we should recruit help, as Jackie, although a very delightful child who he loved so much, was incredibly demanding. She was an overwhelming child. One day in the middle of the night, Jackie got onto our bed. Actually, it was very early in the morning, I have to say. She began jumping up and down, saying she wanted to play. "Mummy, I want to play! I want to play! Will you play, my teddy bear? Will you play? I want to play!" I was so tired. All I wanted to do was sleep. But Jackie refused to stop bouncing all over me. I was so furious. I told her to go to bed at once. But she stamped her foot and said, "But I want to play! I want to play! I'm not tired! I want to play with my teddy bear! Won't you play, Mummy, tea party with me? Tea party?" "Give me Mr. Blue," I said, snatching the teddy bear from her. She was very upset, most aggrieved about that. "I want Mr. Blue! Why are you taking Mr. Blue from... Why are you taking Mr. Blue?" I glared at her, and I told her Mr. Blue is in big trouble for getting me up in the middle of the night, and he must be punished most severely. "Mummy, you can't hurt Mr. Blue! You can't hurt him!" she cried. I stormed out of the house in the early hours of the morning. I ran over to my car, throwing the teddy bear on the driveway. My intention was to drive over that teddy bear, to upset my child, to teach her a lesson. But she ran into the driveway and ran towards the blue teddy bear, lying in the drive. And in a moment of rage, I pressed down the accelerator, running over the teddy bear and continuing to run over my child. I wanted to shut her up. I wanted the exhaustion to go away. And before I knew it, it was too late. My little girl was dead. What had I done? I couldn't believe it. I was trembling. It was like the most awful nightmare. I remember sitting there in the driveway thinking, "Oh God, what have I done?" I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was 2:32 a.m. Fancy noticing a thing like that. I was so devastated to see my child in her white nightshirt, covered in blood. It was the most horrendous sight. She looked like a doll. I began to scream so loudly. I wanted to give myself over to the police, accept responsibility for what I'd done, because I told my husband everything. My husband would not hear of it. He said I was so exhausted, that I wasn't thinking straight. And in a moment of impulsive chaos, I did the unthinkable. He said if he lost me as well, he'd never be able to function properly. So I've lived with this guilt for many years. He said we needed to move on and not to talk about the matter again. But I don't think not talking about it was a good idea, because it is so soul-destroying. I never meant for it to happen."
The old woman began to sob, tears pooling down her face, and this continued for quite a while, with me and her daughter patting her back. Sylvia seemed relieved to see her mother getting out all her pain that had been bottled inside her for so many years. Was this the reason why the deceased girl had got my attention? She wanted her mother to be able to grieve her loss. It would seem so.
"You have no idea, Molly, what Jackie was like," said Sylvia in defence of her mother. "I think she must have had ADHD or something like that. But she wore everybody down. She was constantly having tantrums and wanting to play, and her mood would be as capricious as the weather. I remember looking out of the window in the middle of the night because she'd woken me up. My mother drove over her, but it happened so quickly, and I knew it was a moment when she quite literally had lost leave of her senses. My sister, don't get me wrong, was a beautiful young girl, but she wore us all into the ground, my parents included. And so what happened, in my opinion, was an accident."
"You know, I think the reason your little girl appeared to me, Mrs. Thornton," I told her, "was more for you than for herself. She wanted you to talk about what had transpired that night, so that you could let go of your grief. I think my job is done, and I shall not be going to the police. I think you've suffered enough, Mrs. Thornton. It was good to meet you, and I think your daughter will now go to the light. She won't be bothering me any more. I'm certain of that."
"Thank you, Molly," said Sylvia. "Thank you for helping my mother get over her bottled emotions. It's so good to see her crying, letting it all out. I think she needed this. My mother never meant for this to happen."
"I don't believe she did. In my opinion, it was an accident," I told them. "When I left the ranch-style property through the trees, and I looked back at the gloomy house, it looked lighter. The heaviness had receded. The house almost looked pretty. My heart began to skip in my chest, as if a heavy weight from all those nightmares that had haunted me for years was behind me. A peace came over me, and even though I couldn't see Jackie Thornton, in my mind's eye, I sensed she was smiling at me. As the Bigfoot had promised, he was waiting for me in the grove. He guided me back through the maze of quaking aspen trees, back to my car. He stood there stoically, watching me as I got into the driver's seat, and then he spoke to me in my head and said, "You did good. The girl has gone to the light. She is very satisfied now. She told me to say thank you. She knew her mother never meant to harm her." The Bigfoot nodded at me, turned away, and disappeared into the trees. He looked as if he was floating on air as he moved away. I knew I'd never see him again, but I felt remarkably privileged to have met him. It was 2 weeks later that I stood by Jackie's graveside. I placed some flowers on the grave, and I noticed someone had recently visited the grave, placing a blue teddy bear on it, and there was a note attached to the bear saying, "To my darling Jackie, I'm so sorry for what happened, my love. I wish you were not taken from us so soon. I'm so sorry for what I did, but in that moment I was not thinking. Please forgive me. Your loving mother." I looked at the teddy bear, put it down, with tears filling my eyes. "I do hope you've found your peace now, Jackie," I told her, as I watched a blue butterfly sauntering past the gravesite. The girl had appeared to me one more time in my dreams to say thank you, and also the Bigfoot had done the same, which was equally as bizarre. I thought about how strange it was to encounter such an incredible creature that I knew I would never see again, and there were times I wondered if it had really happened, but I assure you that it did. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, I think that's an incredible story. And how sad for the mother to be so exhausted, to have this tireless daughter that just wouldn't stop bouncing around, wouldn't stop just draining her of all her energies. And in one impulsive moment, she ran her over. And this little girl reached out to her from beyond the grave. What an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.